Good afternoon, Ontario. My name is Jackson Doughart from the National Post and Post Media, and this is Ontario at the Crossroads, our Ontario election debate. In less than a week, Ontarians will go to the polls, and Post Media throughout the election campaign has been providing coverage throughout the province. Today, we are joined by two friends of ours who have kindly agreed to come on and debate the issues that matter most to the province in this campaign. First, I would like to introduce Anthony Furey, who was a Post Media columnist for over a decade before running for mayor of Toronto in the recent by-election. He's a regular voice on talk radio and currently works in government relations and business development. And John Moore is the host of Moore in the Morning on News Talk 1010 Toronto. He wrote for the National Post for 15 years and both the English and French networks of the CBC. He's also an actor who's appeared in several films, including a few Oscar-nominated ones. So today, John will be holding up the left end of the rope and Anthony the right end of the rope. A short programming note as well. In the promotions for this event, Tasha Carradine was originally scheduled to join us. Unfortunately, she has fallen ill. We send her our best wishes and thank Anthony very much for stepping in on short notice in what I'm sure will be a great event for everyone. So thanks to you all for joining us. There will be an opportunity later in the program for some questions from you. We're going to start with a statement from both of our guests, and then we will go through a few topics with a moderated discussion. And then after about half an hour of that, we will take some questions. If you have a comment or a question for us and our guests, please click the Q&A button at the top of your screen, and then there is an option to submit a question, and we will be posing at least a few of them to our guests later on in the program. So thanks to everyone for joining us. We are going to start with a 2-minute statement from each of you. The first question is, the reason that we're having this election is because Doug Ford says he needs a strong, stable majority mandate to navigate the next 4 years. Is he the best person suited of all the leaders to get this mandate and continue as premier? And we're going to start with 2 minutes with Anthony on that one.
Thanks so much, Jackson, and good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a great day, and hello to John as well. Looking forward to this conversation. And I would answer with a firm yes, that Doug Ford is the leader who we need to secure as our premier for the next 4 years, definitely compared to the other two leaders, the Liberal Party and the NDP, because of the times that we face right now. We are in very uncertain economic times. I think a change in leadership would not be good for Ontario. It would not be good for the Ontario economy and Ontario families. And it would be particularly troublesome for a left-leaning or Liberal Party to get in, because what we need right now is responsible stewarding of the economy. That has been Doug Ford's hallmark throughout his time as premier, in his initial leadership race and the first election in 2018 that he won. One of the very first things that he did when he became premier was he put those open for business signs all across the province. And okay, they were just some signs on the highway and near the borders, but I think they were symbolic to the approach that he has consistently brought to his leadership throughout his time as premier. And if the economy is not working, nothing else is working. And Ontario families, I know, are very concerned about how they're going to put food on the table. They're concerned about rising costs, and we need to stay focused on those issues right now. And I think that the left-wing perspective, which is leaned towards distraction issues, woke issues, whatever you want to call them, they are on the wane right now. And I think we're really recalibrating even more towards an economic-focused politics. That's a good thing. And that's where Doug Ford's natural resting place is at right now. So yes, he definitely deserves a renewed majority mandate.
Okay.
Great.
I think that anybody who's expecting me to carry water for Bonnie Crombie or Marit Stiles may be disappointed, because regular listeners to my show and people who used to read my columns in the National Post will know I go by policy, and I really don't care who is in power. So if the question is, do we need an election? I would say no, we didn't need an election. We had a premier with a majority government and two opposition parties, actually three opposition parties, all of whom were ready to backstop him. If the question is, has Doug Ford done a great job, or does he deserve another term? It's a bit more nuanced. You folks, and we've all been talking about this and getting ready for this appearance today. And I would say that Doug Ford has made a lot of mistakes, a lot of very costly mistakes. But then the question, as Anthony has invade, is there a better alternative? And, at the risk of showing my entire hand 4 minutes into this discussion, I would say that Doug Ford probably is the better candidate. But there are a lot of things to be debated. And having been in power for 7 years, there are a lot of things that he probably has to atone for.
Might do a quick follow-up with you, and John, on your comment there. Could you elaborate perhaps a little bit more about what you see as being the failings, if not disqualifying Ford from re-election, then certainly a pivot in policy that you'd be looking for?
Sure. Well, we have to break it out that there have been two Doug Fords, and I like the one we have now much better than the one we had at the beginning, because there was a vindictiveness, there was this meddling and score settling, especially in the city of Toronto. There was the undoing of things that were probably very good policy. But then Doug Ford found his feet. And I've often observed on my show that I think Doug Ford has great bench strength in terms of his cabinet. So this government has accomplished some pretty important things. However, here we are 7 years in, and the healthcare sector is in disarray. We lost time on the matter of the Greenbelt. We probably blew about 8 months where we could have been going and advancing some policy on housing. And then one last criticism would definitely be that, unfortunately, Doug Ford has a policy, or not a policy necessarily, but a practice of blowing money on things, of starting an initiative and then changing his mind. And the beer store, I think, we did not need to blow what could be like $1 billion in order to get out of that deal early. We could have let it lapse. And then the science center, which is a fight I'm done with, but at the same time, we're going to spend more building a new science center than we would have restoring the old one. We got the Ontario Place business. So this is a government which represents itself as fiscally responsible, which has at times been very irresponsible.
Just an opportunity maybe now for maybe a minute or so rebuttal from Anthony on any of those points, but perhaps one thing to address would be the decision to go to an election. We know what, kind of the way that Mr. Ford has framed it, but perhaps you could tell us why you think that it's defensible to be doing this now.
Well, I think that we are in the most uncertain time in Canadian politics that we have been in decades, in my lifetime, really, when we have an existential discussion about Canada, the state of the nation, whether or not we're going to get absorbed into the country to the south of us, if we're finally going to deal with interprovincial trade issues. We are really talking about meaningful questions about Canada, Canadian politics, the Canadian economy. So if there's any time to then go to the polls and say who should be the person to be the steward of at least this province, then now is the time. So I think we are at this moment where it just makes sense. I understand that the thinking among the PC party is that they want to go to the electorate prior to Pierre Poilievre going to the electorate for very strategic reasons. And I guess I'm less supportive of that. That's perhaps more a cynical strategy, but how the election is being rightly discussed is a response to the tariff scenario. Well, this is the time. I mean, now is the time for people to have their say. All these things that we're seeing in the news and responding to Donald Trump, I mean, these are not just Twitter issues for discussion. This is the very real meat and potatoes of politics. So let the people have their say.
At the risk of cribbing Jean Chrétien, though, when he said the proof is the proof is the proof, the mandate is the mandate is the mandate. And Doug Ford has a mandate through to June a year from now. So I don't see that there's been any groundswell either in the populace or certainly any pressure from the opposition saying you don't have the mandate to do what you need to do to fight off Donald Trump. So I think it is, if I can say so, a Trump up.
We're going to come back to the tariff issue a little later in the program, but we want to spend probably the next 20 minutes or so focusing on a few issues and have a little moderated discussion. I'll pick someone to go first, and we can kind of go back and forth. Everyone's been great so far in terms of sticking to the time limits and not interrupting each other, so that's fantastic. So
we'll start doing that soon, I promise you.
Yeah, I'm not a big interrupter.
The first one I want to talk about is drug culture, which has become a hot button issue throughout Ontario. Premier Ford is closing down drug sites within 200 meters of schools and daycares. The question is he taking the right approach to dealing with drug issues? And I'd like to start with John on this one.
I don't think so. I'm a best practices guy, and I've done a ton of reading, including at the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, about safer injection or supervised injection sites. And I just don't think it's the right strategy to shut them down. Reminds me a bit when they came up with this parameter around, daycare centers and schools and stuff like that, that it's a bit like in Florida where they have a policy of a certain perimeter for anybody who's ever been found guilty of a sexual offense. And basically there is nowhere that they can be. And this is why we're shutting down 10 of these centers. And I do believe that the government's heart may be in the right place. I just don't think the research is, because they, say they're going to open these rehab centers, the heart centers. And the problem with that is the presumption that every single person who uses drugs wants to get off drugs. And the sad fact is that they don't. So it's one thing to open up treatment centers. It's another to shut down the centers where there has never been a single fatality from overdose. And also, one last point on this would be to concede that Doug Ford's on the right side of the politics of this. People hate safer injection sites, but the evidence is that they work.
So, Anthony, why do people hate safe injection sites, and why do you think Ford's on the right track here?
Yeah, when I ran for mayor of Toronto, my signature campaign promise, my first press conference I gave was to say I'm going to shut down the drug sites across Toronto and convert them into treatment centers. So I'm 110% in support of what Doug Ford's doing. It's rather curious that he brings in a policy that says we're going to shut down the drug sites within 200 meters of schools and daycares. And then the activists cry and go, oh, most of them are being shut down. This is awful. Well, hold on a second. You put most of them within close proximity to schools, and that in itself shows us that this was flawed from the get-go, from the beginning. If John wants to talk about data, the main piece of data you need to know is that the more drug sites that we have had across Canada, the worse things have gotten, both in terms of the collateral damage and carnage in our communities, but also the number of people who have died from drug overdoses. It's not working. That's what the evidence shows. And when we talk about other jurisdictions, the Portugal model refers people to treatment very aggressively. Lots of decriminalization, but major push to treatment. The mayor of New York City, who is a Democrat, he pushes for mandatory treatment. So right now, what Doug Ford's doing is actually pretty soft compared to what so many other politicians, including left-leaning politicians, are doing all across the Western world. We got to shut them down. This is a major failure. Harm reduction is the god that failed. People put too much faith in it, and we got to get rid of it.
Well, one of the problems is that a lot of the figures have been kind of skewed. I mean, the reason why more people are dying of fentanyl, in particular overdoses, is because it's much more fatal and much stronger. So when people say, why has drug overdoses gone up? Those are, for the most part,
keeping out that much more fatal drug supply, John. That's wild. Our taxpayers are pushing that.
Right. But, again, come back to best practices. And first of all, there is research that suggests that disorder and like public injections and people staggering around and people making drug deals go down around these injection sites. I would point to one that is actually is in Kensington Market. And it is run by a group that also in the same building runs a daycare center. So you have to kind of accommodate that and ask, all right, if somebody running a daycare center is also comfortable having a rehab center or an injection center in the same building, then maybe it's not that much of a conflict.
At the Leslieville drug site, where the mother of two young children was tragically shot and died as collateral damage in gangland warfare, one thing we learned in that is that some of the employees at the drug site are integrated into the criminal nexus. One of those employees has been charged with aiding and abetting. And so many people who work in the harm reduction industry are current or former dealers or addicts themselves. The whole thing is flawed, and we need very aggressive auditors looking into all of this. And we need a timeout on all of it, because I think the main thing we all want is fewer people to die and fewer harms out there. But right now, the system as it's set up is not a good direction.
But I think we fool ourselves into thinking that, we close down the centers and these people are just going to go off and do something else. I mean, what they're going to do is inject in parks around this very same places that we're trying to protect right now. And they're going to inject alone at home and they're going to die.
That's why I don't think anybody out there is saying no other alternative. The rest of us are pushing for treatment. Doug Ford, Daniel Smith, the mayor of Vancouver, treatment is got to be all hands on deck.
Absolutely. There has to be every last access to treatment. But I come back to the point, not everybody wants to get off drugs. We assume that everybody who uses drugs is lying face down in the gutter and on their last legs. And there are all kinds of people out there who use drugs who have no intention of getting off or can't and will not submit to rehab.
Guys, I think we're going to leave that one there. That was a good discussion. My next topic here is about cities and that they're bringing in more bike lanes, and yet the Ford government is moving to block and even remove these lanes, especially in Toronto. Is this the right decision? Anthony, you want to start us off?
Well, that was the second signature policy I campaigned on my campaign here. So I certainly support the Ford government for also doing that as well. The bike lanes have been a disaster on most streets in Toronto where they are put. They should not be on arterial roads. And we used to be able to have this very honest conversation about a decade ago. Things have gotten so out of control where the most vocal and quite frankly, very like rude and aggressive activists are just sort of bullying City Hall to go in this direction. It's an ideology that they're pushing, and it's not the right one. So Yonge and Bloor are the two busiest streets in Toronto, and sort of the signature marquee streets, because they're very long, they're on the subway lines. People who don't live in Toronto have heard of those streets. I'd say Yonge Street is kind of the most famous street in all of Canada. Yonge and Bloor are now one-lane streets. So our two busiest, biggest streets, one lane, because the bike lanes have made up for it. So for starters, ambulances can't get by when there's traffic jams. That's just awful. And second, what sort of message does that send? When we talk about bike lanes in Manhattan and European cities, they have these broader boulevards where a bike lane on Avenue of the Americas in Manhattan, that's not bothering anyone because they have like 4 or 5 vehicle lanes in each direction. There's space for it. We just don't have the space for it here. And yet they keep pushing them more and more. It's madness. It's got to end.
I would say that when it comes to bike lanes, and I'm a cyclist and I'm a commuter cyclist, it's not, as they would say in the mobs, something I'm going to go to the mattresses on. But I will point out that cities, especially Montreal and Paris, for example, have been revolutionized by bike lanes. And I guess one of my chief complaints when it comes to the politics at the provincial level about bike lanes is just jurisdictional. And so Doug Ford trying to settle scores from when he was a city councillor and the brother to the mayor, I feel that is overreach. If Olivia Chow and council want to have bike lanes, then they can live or die by that when they get to their next election day.
I appreciate that jurisdictional distinction. I mean, as I've said, I want it to be at municipal politics so I could bring those things in. So it would be ideal if municipal politicians would. But I think one of the challenges we've seen, I think Doug Ford understands this very well, is that Toronto City Hall and the city halls at other cities across the province are just not focused on the basic economic well-being of their cities, which is why the province, I think, feels that they need to get involved and intervene. I wish they didn't feel the need to do this. I wish there wasn't the appetite for it, but I think they're responding to a strong need here.
Yeah, but that's kind of conservative score settling for people who can't get conservative councillors elected. I mean, I get it. The city is an entity of the province, but Doug Ford's meddling with the city. And again, this comes back to a point I was making earlier about how we end up spending extra money for the things that Doug Ford changes his mind on or the things that he wants to change. And the cost of ripping bike lanes out, if you've been on university, for example, you know, how complicated a reorientation of that street we have executed, and we're just going to go and tear it out at public expense.
That's why it shouldn't have been done in the first place. And I will say there's politicization behind these numbers. Some reports saying it'll cost 50 million to remove the bike lanes. I think the real scandal there is that there was a bureaucrat who wrote a politicized report. Those numbers just aren't true. John, the passions that people have against the bike lanes, I guarantee you I can get a posse of people together with a few crowbars and a pickup truck, and we'll get rid of the bike lanes for a pack of Tim Hortons donuts within 12 hours. We can do it.
Yeah, I look at it, and again, jurisdictionally, I think this is not provincial purview. I also, though, I'll fully acknowledge I had Myrat Stiles on the show, and we were talking about possibly the most hated, if we can rank them, bike lane in Toronto, which is Bloor Street West. It's in her riding, and she would not commit to actually going to battle to save it. But at the same time, it's easy to gang up on cyclists. They're a very, very small number of people. But when you configure a city for cyclists, then more people get on them.
Good discussion, guys. I'd like to move on to another topic here, a couple more topics before we get to some questions from our audience. Premier Ford has repeatedly said that responding to tariff threats from the United States is the key job of the premier right now, and his key issue. Is he right about that? And should this be the primary focus of the next premier? Let's start with John.
Well, it is existential. I think it's the president of Mexico said that this is mutually assured economic destruction. So yes, it's vitally important, but I'd like my premier, whoever it might be, to multitask. And we've got multiple crises that we're dealing with right now. We've got housing, we've got healthcare, and there was a great column by two doctors in The Citizen just this week identifying that we've gone from hallway, people being on beds in hallways in hospitals, ERs, to people being in chairs, and paramedics bringing people in and they languish for like 24, 48 hours. We got a lot of files that we need to pay attention to. So I think it's a bit of a feint and dodge to say that it's all about tariffs and that's why we need Doug Ford 4 more years.
Yeah, I do think that if Doug Ford wasn't responding, then all the oxygen would just be taken up by Donald Trump and whoever else was put forward as the person responding to Trump, whether it was a media personality, journalists, industry representatives. So that is where the oxygen is at right now. And I will say, it was a number of years ago, someone remarked to me, and it was really impressed upon me, that governors in the US see their primary job as being the main trade representative for their state. Their job is to focus on economic flourishing. Whereas if you notice, we have had some leadership in Ontario, particularly Dalton McGuinty and very much so Kathleen Wynne, who think they're more premier dad, premier mom, social engineering, pushing particular agendas on people through the system. And it's nice to see with Doug Ford, someone getting back to what I think should be the role of the provincial leader, which is to be that economic steward and the salesperson in chief out there. And when it comes to the tariff situation, we know that a realignment of tariffs would be a disaster for the auto industry, and we're just going to have to realign so many industries. It just changes the way the Ontario economy works. So, yes, it does need to be the signature issue right now. Are there issues I'm passionate about? John makes great points about healthcare, absolutely, but it's the Trump factor here, and we're not in control of that.
Yeah, Doug Ford's doing peer-to-peer today in meeting governors in the United States. I think that's the right strategy. I also think he's got sort of the personality and the mean of someone that Donald Trump might respond to if we can ever get a meeting. The premiers, Lord love them for the work that they were doing a week ago, but they practically got a meeting with the White House butler. It was not particularly, they didn't move the chess pieces. But yeah, no, this is an existential issue. It needs attention. At the risk of disappointing NDPers and Liberals, I think Doug Ford's probably the better guy to tackle it.
Just to follow up, and something for both of you to weigh in on, what about this kind of jurisdictional question where, Mr. Premier Ford has very much been prominent as a representative of Canada as well as Ontario in terms of trying to advocate with the United States. What about the idea that there's a conflict here with the role that the federal government should be playing representing us internationally? Maybe Anthony, you could start on that one.
I think it would be more of a problem if there wasn't a leadership vacuum at the federal level right now. I understand Mark Carney is going on American television a lot. He's working the phones. In the US, when a candidate does stuff like that, I remember they were talking about charging Donald Trump and others around him with this Logan Act violation thing that says if you're not in office, you can't do diplomacy. So Carney isn't really supposed to be doing that. And Justin Trudeau is obviously the lamest of lame ducks right now, where a lot of people, when we see him in the news, he announces the rail link. We go, oh yeah, that guy's prime minister. I forgot. So I think Doug Ford is able to do this more now, given that there's just a vacuum there right now. And it is not a vacuum that Justin Trudeau immediately rushed to fill. If anything, we know the Trump tariff response is in part why Trudeau has resigned, because Chrystia Freeland first resigned to say she had no faith in him, and that sort of triggered the domino effect. And that was all about the Trump discussions too. So they, Freeland and Trudeau, sort of inadvertently stepped down from that leadership role negotiating with the US.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure that any of us are being heard. I'm glad that Doug Ford, and remember, it's also in his capacity as the chairman of the Premier's Conference. I'm glad he's doing the work, but I don't think anybody in the White House is paying any attention. And I appreciate that Donald Trump personally hates Justin Trudeau and also regards him as a lame duck. But whether or not Ford is going to gain any ground in this, I'm not convinced.
Great discussion, guys. We're going to do one more question here, and then we do have some questions from the audience to get to in our last few minutes. I just wonder if you'd both talk maybe for a minute each on what you think to be the ballot question and signature issue here for voters when they go to the polls next week. Let's start that one with John.
You know what? I don't know that there's necessarily a major ballot question. I mean, Doug Ford thinks that it's all about whether or not he's the right guy to fight Donald Trump and tariffs. I think Ontarians are just sort of looking at the last 7 years and saying, okay, does he deserve another 4 years? I would like to think that a lot of the ballot questions are about things like, as I've mentioned, healthcare, housing, affordability. And in all of those, I don't know that any of the leaders necessarily is the greatest champion. I think it comes down to, are you comfortable with another 4 years of Doug Ford? And I think, well, clearly the poll suggests that a majority of Ontarians are.
Yeah, I would have to agree with John on this one here. I think the two largest files that the province has, healthcare and education, they're not in great shape right now. And that's been something that's been festering over recent decades. At the same time, that's not what's animating people right now. That's not what's in the headlines. So to the degree that people are fired up about this election, and they're not too much, I think the existential questions about Canada and the Canadian economy and the tariffs is the thing that people are thinking about, talking about the most right now. 2022, the last election, was the lowest historical turnout. It was about 42%, and I do anticipate that this will be lower than that. So this will be the lowest turnout ever in an Ontario election. So there's no real zinger of a referendum question right now.
Yeah, the real question, I would think, is who's going to take second place, who's going to lead the opposition. This is about rebuilding the Liberals and about whether or not Marit Stiles survives for another election cycle. But I don't, it's not a change election. Usually you have change on the mandate, and I don't think people see change. I do think that they'd like the Ford administration to change course on a lot of things. I mean, tunneling under the 401 is kind of crazy. Some of the mistakes they've made in this first and second terms are things that maybe they should, as I was saying earlier, atone for. But does Doug Ford deserve to be thrown out? I don't think a lot. Well, I mean, clearly, look at the polls. I think the latest one, they were flirting with 50%.
I do just want to say on that tunnel, one thing that I do get a bit frustrated about with Canadian politics in general is we say, where are the big ideas? And then any that materialize, we automatically knock them down. I did not have that on my bingo card, and I'm not necessarily enamored with the idea, but they want to do a study. They're going to put some money into the study. Let's do it. I mean, traffic is just going to get more horrendous all throughout, my children's and my grandchildren's lives. It's a novel idea. Elon Musk has that company, the Boring Company, which does these quick little 1 kilometer long tunnels. I know that's not what Ford's talking about, but I support any new innovative transit idea. Far be it from me to praise Justin Trudeau, but I like that high-speed rail link. I like any big picture infrastructure thing. So I support investigating this underground tunnel.
Yeah, there are big ideas and then there are dumb ideas. And, notions of, for example, bringing down the Gardner Expressway have been debated for 25 years. I don't know that anybody was ever pitching a tunnel under the 401.
Sounds great, guys. We came in just right on time for the end of our first segment, and we have a bunch of questions here from our audience, which we're going to get to now. We're going to start with really kind of a question about the focus of our discussion or the focus of the campaign. The reader says, "Why is everyone talking only about Toronto, tunnels, drug sites, Ontario Place, Science Centre, bike lanes? What about the rest of the province? Do you guys have anything to say about how Toronto-centric Ontario politics in this campaign have become? Maybe Anthony, if you want to start."
Yeah, I think for one reason, the number of ridings there and the population base there. So I think that's a major factor in all of that. However, Doug Ford's base is in more rural areas. The opposition parties have talked a lot about healthcare when it comes to rural communities. I have family who lives in rural Ontario, and their hospitals have either been shut down or the ERs close at 5 p.m., which is not the point of an ER. I think you're supposed to just be able to go there in the event of a medical emergency. So I think rural issues should be more at the fore, and folks in those communities should make their voices heard more.
Yeah, I'm glad somebody brought this up actually, because we are very Toronto centric and most of the media are located in Toronto. And you're right, it's ridiculous. Living in Sudbury has any interest in debating bike lanes in Toronto? And I've watched the campaign as it unfolds, and I'm always reminded, like, oh, okay, so such and such a leader is in Ottawa. Right, I forgot. This is a provincial election. This is not a municipal election. So I would like to hear people pick up, and I can see the resentment as well. I mean, people are going to hate Toronto no matter what. But yes, we have sucked up a lot of this oxygen.
We actually had a comment as well from a reader who kind of echoes this point, saying Toronto politicians don't seem to appreciate provincial interference, but they certainly have their hands out for taxpayer dollars from the rest of Ontario. So that's their hot take on that one. And another question, Ford gave up on the Greenbelt plan because of allegations of scandal. But don't we need to develop there if we're going to build more houses to address the housing crisis? Maybe a question for you to start, Anthony.
Yeah, I think we need to have a bit more of an honest and fact-based conversation. The Greenbelt is an artificial construct that Dalton McGuinty created about 20 years ago. Some of it is environmentally sensitive lands where, just as an example, I don't know if this is true, but this is the last home of this or that turtle and so forth, and we appreciate why it's there. But a lot of the other acreage on it is just put there to restrict the urban boundary for various political reasons and the sort of growth that we do or don't want to have. And I think it's fine to do that if people are comfortable with building up and being more dense, and if our immigration numbers and mix makes sense. We talk about housing as if it's just a supply issue and not a demand issue. I think we finally began to have an honest conversation about immigration in Canada. I hear it most acutely from recent immigrants themselves who are kind of frustrated with how their communities don't have the basic services, their hospitals are overburdened and so forth. So I think we just need to talk more honestly about what actually the Greenbelt is. And when we're talking about different parts of land, what are they talking about? I think most of us would agree that those environmentally sensitive lands should remain so, but ones that are more marked in that broad swath for political reasons, then we can have the conversation.
Yeah, I think the green belt has been framed as some sort of tree-hugging frippery, when in fact, in a lot of modern urban development, we have created rings around urban centers in order to, contain the sprawl, because ultimately sprawl becomes a huge issue. So, the green belt business, we have enough land. Studies have been released since the whole green belt blow up that find that there is plenty of available land, and certainly in terms of densification. And the solution, in my view anyway, to the housing crisis is not more farm fields in Milton being turned into row housing. It's about finding a way to densify in the urban centers people already want to live in.
Great. More questions from the internet. Ford joked about the electric chair and capital punishment, but other than drugs, what is he offering on law and order and runaway crime? And maybe Anthony will let you tackle that one first.
Yeah, one big concern that people in Toronto have, if I can bring it back to Toronto ridings, is the car thefts are just rampant here. It's largely organized crime in terms of taking a vehicle, getting it in the 401 and booking it up to Montreal as fast as possible. We know that there needs to be more inspections in the ports, and we have seen from both Doug Ford, and he's been working with mayors throughout Ontario to get tougher on those issues. And he's talked about bail reform. So he has actually been very tough on crime just prior to the election. He just hasn't spoken about it right now. And I do wonder why that is, perhaps just because that's not where the conversation's gone. So he is definitely the toughest on crime in that regard, but it's been absent from this election, and maybe we should be discussing it more.
It's a federal jurisdiction, obviously, but I think Doug Ford is mining a very rich vein when he gets into the fears and anxieties that people have about crime. And you're right. Your car's not safe in the driveway, and I have to look both ways up and down the street when I come out of my parking lot in the morning and head to my studios. There are people who are being having their charges dismissed and their trials ended because we can't get around to it. Now, there are things the province can definitely do about the courts. But no, this is sort of an abiding theme of mine, I guess, in today's discussion, which is Doug Ford is on the right side of a lot of these issues in terms of answering the needs and anxieties of Ontarians, even if he may be on the wrong side of policy sometimes.
Another question here that picks up on a point that we kind of only briefly touched on, so a good opportunity to elaborate, perhaps. So this reader is talking about the tunnel idea. He says, why do people think the tunnel is a non-starter when it has been done around the world, so traffic can better move between locations? If not this, then what is your better idea? Maybe John, start with you on this one since Anthony's done the last couple.
Okay, well, it's not the most practical idea, but it's one worth exploring more so. Marit Stiles saying that she wants to find a way to put people on the 407. We have an existing highway that is under capacity, so maybe we find a way to spend public money in order to provide more people access to it. It's just, I look at it and it's like an escalator to the moon. It does not make sense. And, maybe I'll offend a few people, but the future is not the personal solo driving car. And if we start spending billions and billions and billions creating more routes for cars when everything is going to fundamentally be different 40 years from now, then I think it's a foolish investment.
Is it going to be that different 40 years from now, Anthony?
Well, things will be different in many regards. We know the electric vehicle take rate is not actually going to be what Stephen Guilbeault and Justin Trudeau tried to mandate it to be, sort of forcing us to buy those vehicles because they're not there for various reasons. Drone rules have just changed in Canada. Beyond line of sight will be allowed soon, so we're going to see more drone deliveries. Rural areas first, but it will come to the cities eventually, and we're not going to look like the Jetsons when we thought we would. It's funny. We're now in the period where we're coming up to all those Arthur C. Clarke book dates, 2001, 2041. He wrote a bunch of them. And every time we pass one of those, we're like, wait a second, this is not what we thought we would be in all the science fiction timelines. So we're kind of behind the curve there. But to my previous point about the tunnel, and I think the question from the viewer is apt, I just didn't get why the day it was announced, people just guffaw right away, dismiss right away. Well, hold on a second. We're talking about a study. This is something that's years away. We have to plan these things just like we do for subways. I think the big scandal in Toronto is that we had successive subway lines that were canceled. One by Jack Layton in the 1980s, Downtown Relief Line. Mike Harris canceled one. Rob Ford canceled one. It's like, no, we shouldn't have canceled any of these. We need more of this stuff, and we need it sooner, and we need it by tomorrow.
Let me throw this idea in. What about ideas like, more privatization, more congestion pricing, things like that? Where do these fit into the public policy framework that the Ontario government could or should be going? Anthony?
They do not. Congestion pricing, all of that stuff. It's not a good idea. I see Donald Trump has brought in a measure to take away New York's ability to do congestion pricing. I heard from someone the other day who talked about how the city of Columbia, or the country of Columbia, has a rule where you can only drive on certain days of the week based on your license plate. Like, do we want to live in that kind of society? My view is that the goal of government is to facilitate people making their own choices of how they should live the best life. So I don't think that we should come up with alternatives that box them in more. And I always find it curious that left-wing politicians like the congestion pricing, because it shows to me that they are ultimately more about being control freaks and social engineers than they are about helping those of lower means, because that is absolutely prohibitive and punishing to low-income people.
Yeah,
John, you want to jump in on that?
The only fix for this is more transit, not just local transit, but linking cities together. So, I'm not a person who's willing to die on the hill of congestion pricing. I simply, I live in Toronto, very close to the core. I would never drive into the core during the day in either one of the rush hours. So I don't even need congestion pricing. I got congestion.
No, it's a good point, because the people who are suffering through the terrible traffic in the core of Toronto, like, they must have run the numbers and figured out this is really the only meaningful way that they can get there. And that really sucks to be them, because it is atrocious. John's right. When I go to downtown Toronto, I park far out, and because I'm able to, I walk all the way in, because I'm like, I'm not getting my car anywhere near this large radius.
Great, guys. We got a couple more questions here before we wrap up. So thanks for everything so far. A question here from reader: how does Ford justify, or how can Ford justify the long, expensive foreign contract to rebuild Ontario Place? We have thoughts on that, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to learn more about this process and these contracts. I think people would prefer open tender, open bidding, and it's one of those decisions that, like, Ontario Place was a dump. The people who say, like, they had to leave it how it was, like, that's just not true at all. I mean, the land was not being properly managed. It was not something that was enjoyable. It wasn't an attraction. But at the same time, anyone who has concerns about the process, they're right to voice them. You have to make a decision at some point on the vendor and the bidding and so forth. But I think you're going to hear more reports and more questions about how they're proceeding with all of this.
I often say that Toronto is the city of the eternal plan. And of course, Ontario Place is provincial jurisdiction, but I have my reservations about the idea of putting a spa in there. I appreciate it's going to be a lot more like, Great Wolf Lodge than it is about a bunch of people sitting around with cucumbers in their eyes. But a 99-year lease on what is an extraordinarily valuable and precious piece of land, and the province being on the hook to build the parking lot. And one last point, I often suspect that the reason they are moving the science center is so they can justify building the parking lot on behalf of a private company.
And we've got time for one more here, gentlemen. The question is Ford spending the election hiding? This person asks. There is no campaign bus. He's been in the United States as much as in the province of Ontario. He's relying on people not paying attention to get him reelected. John, any thoughts about that theory?
Well, you can understand politically and strategically why he's doing this. But yes, there is. He's not a nuclear submarine, but he is fairly stealth. We've received signals that he will not be doing any interviews. So all of the leaders are appearing on our show next week, but Doug Ford won't. But again, to come back to strategy, if you were running this campaign and you were in the lead, why would you expose your leader to the potential of him getting into a gaffe?
I think there is a campaign bus. It has the big Protect Ontario slogan on it that they're using for this. But I think the fact that people aren't aware there's a bus is also speaking to the fact that there hasn't been that much media coverage of this election compared to others. There can be 1 or 2 days in the week where we don't really talk about the election, which is a little odd. It's a little rare. So I think it shows just the general public interest. The candidates are out there. They're out there knocking on the doors, and Doug Ford's going down to the U.S. because he has the benefit of being the sitting premier and the candidate for the leading party at the same time. So that's why he's able to go down in this sort of unique moment in history to do events in the United States. So I think he's able to have his cake and eat it too, and I don't fault him for that, because that's just the cards that they've been dealt in terms of the issues that have risen to the fore.
Although, to close the loop from where we started out about whether or not this is a necessary election, clearly it's not. There is not going to be any change. There'll be a couple of seats here, a couple of seats there, maybe the opposition leader, but this election was never required, and it's going to result in the same verdict again.
Good place to end there, guys. And we're right at 1:45 or 12:45 where we plan to end up. So I just want to say thanks to you both on behalf of Post Media for joining us. This is something that we did last time with John and Tasha that went really well, and we were eager to do it again. And I think it's something that our audience will have gotten a lot out of. So thanks to both of you for joining us, and especially to our viewers today, and especially those who put some great questions forward. We look forward to continuing the discussion over the next week. Please visit nationalpost.com, as well as your local Post Media publication for coverage throughout the rest of the campaign. And we thank all of you for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys.